Imagine a government that puts problem solving first. One that takes action on issues most Americans care about, like our budget, economy, and environment, instead of being dominated by extremists on the left and the right. What would it take to get that kind of government? A lot less than you might think. The key is electing a handful of centrist, independent leaders who aren't beholden to any political party.
The way we're going to do something better is by looking at the segment of the population that is unrepresented in the political system, and that's folks in the middle. Now, it also so happens that folks in the middle are the pragmatists who probably have the most traction towards solving the real issues that we care about.
I think we're going to get a whole new crop of political leaders out of this chaos, and I hope some new political movements as well. As I've been saying for a year now, if you're an old school liberal, then an old school conservative is no longer your enemy. I really think a new center can arise from this, and if Trump is smart, he can actually make that happen.
Be a founder. Make an impact. Join us today.
The political divide has grown rapidly in the last couple of years. People who were already committed to a particular leaning in the past have moved further to their respective side. But there's a particular gaggle of people, mostly found online, who have firmly declared themselves to be unaffiliated, the so-called centrists. And as the political divide continues to grow, they grow ever more smug, as though a widening political chasm is somehow making them stronger. But this couldn't be further from reality. For the last couple of decades, the center has effectively collapsed. The fact that this data ends in 2014 should really drive the point home. But in my travels through the various political discussion spheres of the internet, I quickly noticed something. Centrists never seem to be any less opinionated than anyone who chooses a more specific label, and I believe that this exposes a fundamental dishonesty. Centrists are those trumpeting the political horseshoe, loudly flexing the golden mean to make sure everyone knows how smart they are for not picking a side. After all, it's rather easy to sit back and criticize. Almost any political idea or position has holes just begging to be poked in it, regardless of how broadly the concept may hold up in general. There's always a flaw to be found, and so the centrist hovers around with his needle, looking for balloons to pop. Some self-described centrists will tell you that they're simply unaffiliated, but once you spent enough time talking to them, you will begin to notice a network of opinions that squarely push them towards one position or another. Beliefs on various issues don't just exist in isolation from one another, but rather in a coordinate series of beliefs that align with and support one another. For example, if one believes that racial discrimination against blacks is a serious and persistent problem, they're also likely to believe that this discrimination results in unjust overrepresentation of blacks in criminal convictions, or an overrepresentation of blacks as targets of officer-involved shootings. The centrist, like any other politically engaged person, will inevitably have opinions of some kind, and will therefore have coordinate opinions which follow from the foundational ones. So their claim to centrism ultimately comes down to moderation. They will invariably fall towards one fitting label or another, but are unwilling to commit to that label for whatever reason. I would submit that it's more or less impossible to be both politically engaged and also unaffiliated. If one is engaged in a political discussion to begin with, they must have some sort of motivation for doing so, a stake in the conversation. The only truly unaffiliated people are those who are entirely apolitical, who don't feel they have a stake and therefore don't participate in the discussion at all. So when centrists try to claim that they're unaffiliated, they're just refusing to commit to positions they do hold in reality, positions that will become obvious if you keep the conversation going for long enough. Within each of the two main political wings, there are numerous specific positions one could take. Almost anyone at any point on the spectrum could handily pick a label to accurately describe their overall views, without having to wear the centrist mask. Some are honest enough to just call themselves moderates, but one who is moderately in one position or another will still hold a bias towards that position and against competing or opposed positions. They will still tend to agree with and support those who share a core belief with them, even if they may not agree on every detail. This is observable in real-world situations, such as the municipality of Molenbeek in the capital region of Brussels, Belgium. The terrorists who committed the Bataclan shooting in Paris were knowingly harbored by so-called moderate Muslim residents of Molenbeek.
Nabil Mujahid is a teacher who lived there for 7 years. He says it has a lot to do with communities being so isolated.
À aucun moment on a fait un effort de les intégrer eux. D'ailleurs, quand on leur parle, on leur dit vous êtes marocain, vous êtes turc, etc. Donc c'est ce sentiment s'est exacerbé et au final, ça donne justement des jeunes qui sont issus de la deuxième ou troisième génération et qui ont toujours autant de mal à s'intégrer dans la société belge alors que eux sont belges.
A moderate supporter of Black Lives Matter, or Antifa, may not take to the streets to burn police cars and bash shop windows, but they will defend and excuse the devout actors who do.
I'm seen as this angry black person, or I'm seen as, I'm seen as this rioter or this looter. Shut it down! Shut it wide! Is a justified expression of anger, of frustration, of losing black life at a consistent basis.
I said I'm tired of being peaceful and tired of being calm. You know, they've been going to war on us for over 400 years. So, hey, I ain't peaceful. I ain't no protester. I'm violent.
Hands up, don't shoot. That chant that we heard constantly, from all evidence, that was not true. That did not happen. Isn't it important to acknowledge that?
Well, listen, I think it's important to acknowledge that some things are possible and some things are provable. It is certainly not provable that Mike Brown had his hands up. And I think it's important for people who care about facts to be willing to talk about that in a straightforward manner. We'll never know what happened. Something strange happened. You did have that video of those construction workers who were white and watching. They put their hands up after the shooting and said something happened that was wrong. But much more importantly, this thing was about Mike Brown for about 2 weeks. After that, it became a cry of a generation that feels that it is criminalized and guilty until it's proven innocent, rather than innocent until proven guilty, all too often.
Even centrist political parties in the real world almost always sell themselves as center-left, center-right, or center-something, and will typically side with so-called extreme parties when a shared interest or belief happens to align. Or, in other words, the centrist is part of something greater than themselves, whether they'll openly admit to it or not. If a so-called moderate's true position aligns with and supports a more extreme position, what the centrist is willing to openly say or do becomes irrelevant. In some cases, this can even manifest as a conscious calculation, such as when a garden variety Democrat looks the other way from activists rioting in the street. They won't say they endorse it, but they won't condemn it either. It's convenient for them. It doesn't make much of a difference if someone is a moderate or devout believer in a grounding principle. If they agree on the fundamentals, then the minutia of whatever differences they do have will be eclipsed by the bigger picture, by shared interests and objectives. And so, in that broader context, you arrive at a distinction without a difference. None of this is meant to suggest that you can't respectfully disagree with political opponents. This is another commonly cited point of pride for centrists, but it seems both pretentious and, again, dishonest to try and claim a monopoly on civil discourse, as if to suggest that this is an impossible task for those who clearly state their allegiances. Even people who could be described as my sworn political enemies have granted me the pleasure of politely discussing our differences. But this in itself only reinforces my disdain for centrism. If being a centrist or moderate just means having the ability to engage in civil discussion, then I could personally point you to moderate anarcho-capitalists, moderate Trotskyists, and moderate National Socialists. See how silly that sounds? After all, you can't kind of be a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary. It's a binary question. Someone who won't state their beliefs openly and stand by them comes off as lacking the courage of their convictions, or having some underhanded reason for refusing to commit. Essentially, when one describes themselves as a centrist or moderate, full stop, they're leaving out key information about what their actual position is. Why not just be honest and specific about what it is you really believe? After all, someone who is sincerely apathetic and unaffiliated wouldn't bother to say so, would they? If you're engaging in political discussion on a regular basis, then you are almost certainly on a side, whether you're willing to admit it or not. So stop pretending otherwise and just own your beliefs, because at the end of the day, you really aren't fooling anyone.